In April of 2008, a man named Sonny Graham left his home in South Carolina to take his 9-year-old stepson to a dentist appointment. It seemed like an ordinary morning. After dropping the boy off, Sonny returned home and continued with his work routine. He had started a small landscaping business and often spent part of the day organizing equipment in a shed built behind the house. Sometime later, Sonny walked into that shed. Minutes later, a gunshot echoed from inside the building. When his body was discovered, authorities confirmed that he had taken his own life with a Remington 12-gauge shotgun. Sonny Graham was 69 years old. At first glance, the case appeared to be another personal tragedy. Painful, but unfortunately not uncommon. But there was one detail in Sonny Graham's story that would make his death far more unusual. Years earlier, Sonny had received a heart transplant. The organ that saved his life had belonged to a man named Terry Cottle. Terry was only 33 years old when he died. He had also taken his own life. But the connection between these two men would not end with the transplant. Several years later, Sonny Graham began a relationship with Cheryl Cottle, the widow of the man whose heart was now beating inside his chest. Eventually, the two of them married. The case quickly drew attention because of this improbable sequence of events. Two men connected by the same heart, two deaths by suicide, and between them, a relationship that few people could have imagined. But this story also raises an unusual question. How much can a transplant change a person? To understand how this story unfolded, we need to go back several years, long before the transplant, long before the marriage, back to the moment when it all began, the life of Terry Cottle. To understand how this story began, we need to go back to the early 1990s. At the time, Terry Cottle was living in the state of South Carolina. He was a relatively young man, married to Cheryl, and the two of them were building a life together. Even so, the relationship was never entirely stable. According to later accounts, the marriage went through periods of tension and temporary separations. Despite this, Terry and Cheryl remained together for several years and eventually started a family with children. For a time, their lives appeared to follow a relatively ordinary path. But over the years, the conflicts between them began to intensify. Arguments became more frequent. Eventually, the relationship entered a breaking point. At one point, Terry left the house and began living with his sister, Tammy Erickson. The separation suggested that the marriage had reached a critical stage. Even so, Terry still attempted reconciliation. In March of 1995, he reached out to Cheryl again, hoping to restore the relationship. The conversation, however, did not end the way he had hoped. Cheryl made it clear that she did not intend to remain married. Divorce now seemed inevitable. That night, the two reached an agreement. The following day, Terry would return to the house to collect his belongings and continue his life separately. But the next morning would take a very different turn. On March 15, 1995, Terry woke up and went into the bathroom of the house. A short time later, a gunshot was heard. When family members entered the room, Terry Cottle was already dead. He had taken his own life with a .22 caliber revolver. Terry was only 33 years old. The body was discovered by his son, Christopher, who was just 10 years old at the time. Authorities officially ruled the death a suicide. In the days that followed, Cheryl and other members of the family faced a difficult decision. Even in the midst of shock and grief, they chose to authorize the donation of Terry's organs. Among them was his heart. That decision would ultimately connect Terry Cottle's story to that of a man he had never met, a man named Sonny Graham. At that same time, hundreds of miles away, Sonny was facing a fight of his own for survival, a fight that depended on exactly the kind of donation that had just been authorized. And within days, the paths of these two men would cross in a way neither of them could have imagined. During that same period, while Terry Cottle's family was dealing with their sudden loss, another man was facing a crisis of his own. His name was Sonny Graham, a resident of Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. Sonny was a veteran who had lived a relatively active life, but in the early 1990s, his health began to deteriorate rapidly. He had developed a serious heart condition. Over time, the muscle of his heart weakened to the point that it severely threatened his chances of survival. Without a transplant, doctors knew his options were extremely limited. Sonny was eventually placed on the national waiting list for a compatible heart, a process that for many patients can take months or even years. During that time, every phone call could mean a new chance at life. In March of 1995, that call finally came. Doctors had found a compatible heart. The organ came from a donor who had died only days earlier. The surgery was performed shortly afterward. The transplant was considered a success. The heart now beating inside Sonny Graham's chest had once belonged to Terry Cottle. In the months that followed, Sonny began to recover. As happens with many transplant patients, that moment represented a kind of second chance. Friends would later recall that Sonny seemed deeply grateful to still be alive. He often spoke about the man whose death had made his survival possible. At times, he even said he felt a certain emotional weight when thinking about the story behind that heart. Even so, his recovery appeared to be moving in a positive direction. Gradually, Sonny returned to his normal routine, but there was one question that remained in his mind. He wanted to know who the person was who had given him that second chance. In transplant cases, hospitals usually maintain anonymity between the families involved. Even so, many recipients choose to write anonymous letters of gratitude to the relatives of their donors. Several years after the surgery, Sonny decided to do exactly that. He wrote a letter to the family of Terry Cottle. What began as a simple gesture of gratitude would eventually trigger a sequence of events no one could have predicted, because that letter would reach the hands of Cheryl Cottle, Terry's widow, and from that moment on, an unexpected relationship would begin to develop. The letter Sonny Graham wrote to the family of Terry Cottle began as a relatively common gesture. In many transplant cases, recipients try to thank the donor's family. For many of them, it is a way to acknowledge the weight of the decision that allowed another life to be saved. At first, the contact between Sonny and Terry's family happened through those letters. Over time, the communication became less formal. Eventually, Sonny and Cheryl Cottle agreed to meet in person. The meeting took place during a dinner. According to later accounts, Sonny was immediately struck when he met Cheryl. For him, she represented not only the widow of the man whose heart was now beating inside his chest, but also a direct connection to the story behind that transplant. Cheryl, on the other hand, initially showed no romantic interest. At that point, the meeting seemed to be nothing more than a courteous gesture between two people connected by an unusual experience. Even so, a friendship began to form. In the months that followed, Sonny and Cheryl remained in contact. Their relationship gradually became closer.
Over time, that friendship began to evolve into something more complex. In 2001, a decision surprised many of the people around them. Sonny and Cheryl chose to end their respective relationships and be together. The situation was unusual. Sonny was now involved with the woman whose husband had been the donor of the heart that kept him alive. To some people close to them, the relationship seemed strange. To others, it simply seemed like an unexpected consequence of a story that had been unusual from the very beginning. Despite the mixed reactions, Sonny and Cheryl moved forward. Their relationship continued to deepen. Sometime later, the two decided to get married. For the public who would later hear this story, this would become one of the most intriguing aspects of the case. A man living with another man's heart, married to that man's widow. But the events that followed would show that this story was far from over. In the years that followed, signs that something was not right would begin to appear.
In the first years after their marriage, Sonny and Cheryl tried to build a relatively quiet life. The couple moved to a more rural area, and Sonny began investing in a new professional project. He opened a small landscaping business, a job that required physical effort but also gave him a sense of independence. To those observing from the outside, it seemed that Sonny was making the most of the second chance he had received after the transplant. But over time, some people close to him began to notice changes in his behavior. Several friends later reported that Sonny seemed different from the man they had known before the surgery. According to those accounts, he began drinking more frequently. Some also mentioned changes in his eating habits. Sonny began regularly consuming beer and hot dogs, a combination that, interestingly, had reportedly been one of Terry Cottle's favorite foods. There is no scientific evidence suggesting that these changes were related to the transplant, but that detail would later be mentioned repeatedly once the story became public.
Meanwhile, Sonny and Cheryl's relationship also faced difficulties. Reports indicate that their marriage went through periods of tension and temporary separations. Some people close to them even described the relationship as unstable. At the same time, Sonny's financial situation began to deteriorate. Although his landscaping business was operating, it did not seem to provide the stability he had hoped for. Over time, debts began to accumulate. Even so, the couple eventually reconciled and remarried in December of 2004 after a period of separation. In the years that followed, Sonny continued working and trying to maintain a normal routine, but signs of emotional strain were still noticed by people close to him.
In April of 2008, the story would reach its final chapter. That morning, Sonny left home to take his stepson to the dentist. Afterward, he returned to the property where he lived with Cheryl. Sometime later, he entered a shed located in the backyard. Minutes later, a gunshot was heard. Sonny Graham had taken his own life with a Remington 12-gauge shotgun. He was 69 years old. After his death, several questions began to emerge. Among them was the possibility that emotional, financial, or marital factors may have contributed to the outcome of the story. Authorities began reviewing the events that had led to that morning in 2008, and additional details about Sonny and Cheryl's relationship would soon draw attention.
After Sonny Graham's death, authorities initiated the standard procedures for cases involving death by firearm. The circumstances indicated suicide. Even so, certain aspects of the story drew attention, especially the unusual context linking Sonny to the family of Terry Cottle. During the review of the case, investigators also spoke with people close to the couple. Some accounts suggested that Sonny and Cheryl's relationship had gone through periods of conflict. Former partners of Cheryl also mentioned that she had a personality some described as difficult. At times, they reported episodes of aggressive behavior and threats. These details became part of the initial analysis of the case. However, no concrete evidence suggested that Sonny had been the victim of homicide. There were no signs of a struggle and no indication that another person had intervened at the moment of his death. The official conclusion remained unchanged: suicide.
Even after the investigation was closed, Sonny Graham's story continued to attract attention for another reason: the coincidence involving the two suicides. Terry Cottle had taken his own life in 1995. 13 years later, the man who received his heart met the same fate. This coincidence led some people to raise a controversial hypothesis: the idea that organ transplants might transfer certain behavioral traits between donor and recipient. This hypothesis became known as cellular memory. If such a possibility were real, it would suggest that certain biological information might exist outside the brain, something that remains a subject of scientific debate.
Some researchers have explored this idea over the years. One name frequently associated with the discussion is researcher Paul Pearsall. In a study conducted in the early 2000s, Pearsall interviewed dozens of patients who had received heart transplants. Some reported unexpected changes after surgery, including new food preferences, shifts in mood, or habits that, according to them, had not been part of their personality before. But this hypothesis remains highly controversial. Most of the scientific community considers that there is no solid evidence supporting the existence of memory stored in transplanted organs. Behavioral changes after a transplant can be explained by several factors: the psychological impact of surviving a life-threatening condition, side effects from immunosuppressant medications, lifestyle changes, or simply coincidence.
In Sonny Graham's case, there is no scientific evidence directly connecting the transplant to his suicide. Even so, the sequence of events involving Terry Cottle, Sonny Graham, and Cheryl Cottle has turned this story into one of the most frequently cited examples whenever the topic of cellular memory appears in public discussions. Two men connected by the same heart, separated by 13 years, and linked by a story that continues to raise questions. Some people see in this story nothing more than a tragic coincidence. Others believe it suggests something more difficult to explain. But that is exactly the question that remains. To what extent are events like this simply coincidence? And to what extent might there still be aspects of the human experience that science does not yet fully understand? If you would like to share your thoughts about this, feel free to leave them in the comments.